Vault Tec presented itself as a salvation plan, a private corporation that would shelter Americans from nuclear annihilation with sealed, self-sufficient vaults. The harder evidence, leaked schematics, overseer logs recovered in ruined vaults, and the sheer variety of vault designs, points to a very different purpose. Rather than a uniform civil defense program, the vaults functioned as controlled experiments, each one set up to observe how people behaved under engineered conditions and to collect data valuable to the pre-war elite. Those artifacts show deliberate variation. Vaults with altered social structure, extreme scarcity, biometric monitoring, or secret genetic and chemical interventions. Overseer logs record protocols, measurements, and rationales that treat human subjects like test variables. The result was a system that could produce not only survival plans, but behavioral data, prototypes for population control, and medical and social research tailored to those in power. Understanding Vault Tec's founding and the engineering behind the vaults is the key to seeing how a company that claimed to save lives was actually building a laboratory beneath America's surface, and why the consequences mattered long after the bombs fell. Vault Tec rose to prominence at a time when fear of nuclear war was baked into government policy. For decades before the Great War, planners treated an atomic attack as an engineering problem. Shelter population centers, preserve infrastructure, and keep useful human capital for a post-bomb world. That logic created demand for contractors who could turn civil defense rhetoric into concrete plans. Vault Tec met that need with a polished public face, slick brochures, a cheerful mascot, televised model vaults, promising safety, comfort, and continuity underground. Those promises appear across the games in promotional holotapes, radio spots, and the Vault Boy icon. But the materials recovered inside many vaults tell a different story. Overseer terminals, confidential memos, and blueprints frequently record test plans, measurement protocols, and instructions for observing and recording behavior. Vault Tec staff refer to program parameters, subject groups, and data collection. Where marketing sells survival, internal documents treat residents as subjects in controlled studies. Vault Tec's role as the primary contractor reflected technical competence, political connections, and a willingness to accept classified government terms. Background logs and terminal entries imply the Vault program received financing and oversight from military and patriotic interests who wanted both shelters and usable research. That mix explains why vaults were marketed as luxury refuges while being built as sealed laboratories. One set of stakeholders wanted civilian protection, another wanted controlled data about human behavior under extreme conditions. The vault designs themselves make that dual purpose visible. If the goal had been only fallout protection, blueprints would prioritize redundant life support, straightforward food storage, and robust power systems. Instead, surviving designs emphasize control and observation. Control rooms, overseer terminals, monitoring corridors, surveillance arrays, sealed observation chambers, one-way windows, automated lockdown mechanisms, and computer systems programmed to enact and log interventions are standard features. Many installations add architecture that has no clear life extension purpose beyond giving researchers the means to isolate, vary conditions, and watch subjects over time. These architectural choices recur across multiple vaults. Some split populations into rigid social units. Others include quarantine wings or medical labs. Many are arranged to separate residents into experimental cohorts. Overseer terminals and holotapes go beyond passive monitoring. They contain experiment briefs, target outcomes, and instructions about when to intervene and when to let variables run. The overseer role, presented as day-to-day management, often functions as a field technician role, with the overseer enacting, documenting, and reporting manipulations. That documentation is central because it looks like the output of an organized research program rather than improvised records from a catastrophe. Vault archives frequently contain structured data, logged incidents, timed interventions, demographic breakdowns, and explicit hypotheses. Holotapes sometimes record Vault Tec scientists and project managers discussing how to measure compliance, reproduction rates, immune response, or group dynamics under engineered stresses. Those are research variables, not survival priorities. The military and government appetite for that knowledge helps explain why Vault Tec continued to receive backing despite ethical problems. Planners imagining a post-war world valued data on human behavior during long-term isolation, resource scarcity, or engineered shortages. Information about who would remain cooperative, who would fracture socially, and how disease, mutation, or controlled breeding could change a population had immediate strategic implications. If the pre-war elite could predict, select, or engineer a more governable or resilient population, they could shape the composition of the world that followed the bombs. Vault Tec's facilities were an attractive vehicle. They could house controlled cohorts, manipulate variables with little public scrutiny, and record results for later analysis. Bureaucratic cover made these experiments practicable. Vault Tec advertised broadly and coordinated placement and staffing, while a smaller, classified program set experimental goals and technical specifications dictating how vaults should be built. The result was a dual-track operation, a public program that spread the idea of safety and continuity, and a classified program that designed vaults as laboratories. Dual-use elements in schematics, air filtration tied to monitoring systems, food storage integrated with rationing controls, residential layouts oriented around observation corridors, show how deeply the hidden mandate shaped design decisions. By the time the bombs fell, Vault Tec had produced a portfolio of controlled environments rather than a fleet of uniform bunkers. That variety is the smoking gun. The program optimized different vaults for different kinds of observation, social stress, medical trials, isolation dynamics, and more. The pattern of variation, emphasis on isolation, contingency control, and systematic measurement, shows that the public narrative of salvation was a deliberate cover for a research agenda with political and military value. Understanding those political conditions and the engineering choices that turned shelters into observation platforms is the first step in seeing the vaults not as sanctuaries, but as instruments designed to produce data about humanity. The next chapter will trace what those instruments were set to measure and how those measurements were implemented inside specific vaults. The classified mandate didn't linger on paper. It was built into the architecture. Vault Tec's blueprints show more than sheltering capacity. They show experiment rooms, observation corridors, and redundant control closets tied to monitoring rigs. Once the doors sealed, the vaults became laboratories where variables could be isolated and manipulated. Those variables fall into recurring categories: social engineering, biological and genetic manipulation, reproductive and gender experiments, and ecological trials. Each used the same basic toolkit: sealed life support, automated control systems, overseer terminals and holotapes for logging, and purpose-built infrastructure tuned to the experiment at hand. Social engineering tests were the most common. Vault 11 is the clearest example. Its terminals and public records spell out a designed moral dilemma. In Vault 11, residents discovered that the door would only reopen if one person was sacrificed annually, and the resulting internal logs track decisions and outcomes. That setup was not a byproduct of catastrophe. It was a controlled stressor meant to measure collective choice, compliance, and the breakdown of civic institutions under pressure. Vault 101, by contrast, functioned as a control in narrative, if not in official wording. Its ostensible experiment was seclusion itself. Keep a population locked away and record how normal social structures adapt or calcify over generations. Vault 112 pushed social engineering into the psychological realm. There, virtual reality pods created an artificial suburban world, Tranquility Lane, where inhabitants were sedated into an alternate life while Vault Tec recorded responses to extended manufactured bliss or trauma. Much of what we know about these tests comes from overseer logs and holotapes left in-game. They list timelines, compliance rates, and behavioral observations that read like clinical notes rather than evacuation diaries. Biological and genetic manipulation formed a second, darker thread. The nexus for this is Vault 87, one of Vault Tec's sealed research facilities tied, in Fallout 3, to the Forced Evolutionary Virus, FEV. Terminals and scattered documents link Vault 87 to classified FEV work, containment labs, incubation chambers, and medical records that track progressive mutation. The result, supermutants, was not collateral, but an outcome measured against Vault Tec's intended endpoints: transmissibility, survivability, and physiological changes under sealed conditions. In-game evidence comes from medical logs, security reports, and the physical layout. Heavy, tiered biocontainment areas and equipment that could only serve a sustained program of experimentation. Reproductive and gender-focused experiments were another explicit line of inquiry. Vault 69 is notable for its design: a majority female population with a single male resident. The Vault's logs frame this as a controlled study in reproductive dynamics, population genetics, and social structure when gender ratios are deliberately skewed. Holotapes and personnel files record selection criteria, reproductive directives, and the social protocols imposed on inhabitants. Again, technical documentation that treats people as variables in long-term demographic research. Ecological and agricultural trials constituted a separate engineering challenge, and Vault 22 provides a cautionary example. Built with greenhouses, soil labs, and sophisticated nutrient distribution systems, Vault 22 was meant to test controlled ecosystems, how plant life, microbes, and human hosts would interact in closed biospheres. Instead, a fungal outbreak spread inside the vault, transforming inhabitants and producing a toxic, mutagenic ecology. The terminal logs are clinical. Inoculation schedules, pathogen sampling notes, and environmental telemetry that show Vault Tec was tracking rates of infection, spore propagation, and ecological collapse as if they were expected outcomes to be quantified. Across these categories, the technical means were consistent. Air filtration and HVAC systems were tied into central monitoring racks. Atmosphere composition, pressure, and contamination levels could be dialed remotely or programmed on schedules. Food storage and dispensing systems were coupled to rationing controls and inventory logs that recorded consumption patterns and responses to scarcity. Doors, lights, and even education and entertainment feeds were networked to overseer consoles that logged interactions and could trigger experimental stimuli, lockdowns, selective deprivation, or simulated emergencies. Cameras and motion sensors recorded movement and social clustering, while secure holotapes and terminal entries captured interviews, confessions, and overseer rationales. Those records turned human behavior into data streams: compliance rates, moral choices, health metrics, fertility statistics, pathogen curves. The in-game records bear this out. Overseer terminals often include not just narrative fragments, but explicit study goals, measurable endpoints, trial durations, and success metrics. Some logs read like research proposals, objectives, methods, criteria, clearly intended for review by Vault Tec's classified program officers or their government contractors. Holotapes provide human context: frightened residents, rationalizing overseers, and technicians who sometimes expressed ethical doubts. Together, the technical schematics and the voices left behind show experimenters who anticipated certain outcomes and built systems to capture the evidence. Outcomes varied, and that variance is itself part of the dataset. In several vaults, the experiment resulted in collapse, social systems imploded, disease or psychological stress led to mass fatalities, or environmental controls failed catastrophically. Vault 22's ecological failure and Vault 11's social implosion are textbook examples of experiments that produced destructive, non-recoverable results. Some vaults generated persistent, transformed populations. Vault 87's supermutants and Vault 69's demographic distortions produced groups that altered the post-war human landscape. Other facilities yielded subtler changes: cultural ossification, new religious movements, or institutional pathologies that lasted generations. Even where a vault didn't fail, the data it produced could be repurposed. Reconstructions of optimal population control, dispensable labor units, or bioweapons strategies were all possible translations of Vault Tec's findings. Vault Tec's bureaucracy treated these outcomes as results to be catalogued. The monitoring networks and overseer reporting systems ensured a flow of information out of each sealed experiment. Those streams were valuable to pre-war planners and, later, to post-war actors who recovered Vault Tec records and technologies. The physical experiments converted social hypotheses into material outcomes. Mutated bodies, fractured societies, and documented case studies that other factions could study or weaponize. By the time the doors opened, Vault Tec had not only run tests, but produced a library of experiments with distinct, often catastrophic results. The next chapter looks at how those outcomes fed into the strategic plans of the pre-war elite, how the data vaults generated shaped ideas about governance, population selection, and post-apocalyptic control. What made those outcomes valuable to the pre-war elite wasn't spectacle, but information. Vault Tec didn't run cruelty for its own sake. It turned human behavior into measurable variables, logged outcomes, and delivered datasets to clients with the means to act. Government agencies, military planners, and corporate backers treated catastrophe as an opportunity to test social and biological interventions at scale. The vaults were not only survival experiments, they were prototypes for post-war governance. The most immediate payoff was practical knowledge about population control. Vault rosters, amenities, and constraints were designed to produce predictable stressors. Resource scarcity, skewed sex ratios, imposed leadership structures, engineered isolation. Overseer terminals and holotapes, most explicitly detailed in Fallout 4's Vault Tec workshop material, show that every program element was instrumented. Cameras, pressure sensors, air cycle monitors, ration logs, and morale scores were recorded. That telemetry translated into policies: how long a population could be kept under rationing before revolt, which social engineering tactics broke cohesion, which ration formulas affected fertility, and how rituals could be used to discipline communities. For planners imagining how to shape a post-nuclear society, those were blueprints, not curiosities. Vault Tec's biological work was equally consequential. Vault 87's sealed FEV experiments produced supermutants and provided a concrete example of what happens when a pathogen is weaponized or misapplied in sealed populations. Whether Vault Tec invented, adapted, or merely housed the forced evolutionary virus, the practical outcome was the same: an in-world demonstration of large-scale human transformation. That knowledge was later repurposed across the wastes, by militarized remnants facing manpower shortages and by opportunists trying to weaponize mutation. Demography-focused vaults offered another form of leverage. Vault 69, with its heavy gender imbalance, tested mating systems, sexual politics, and long-term genetic effects in isolation. The data such vaults produced could inform breeding policies or selection practices, which social arrangements concentrated or denied reproductive power, how stress alters family structures, and which demographic manipulations yield compliant or resilient populations. These are practical inputs for anyone attempting to shape future citizen bodies and loyalties. Social engineering experiments, Vault 11's enforced moral dilemma among the most infamous, gave direct lessons in governance. Vault 11 forced a society to accept ritualized sacrifice as survival's price. The recorded collapse into justification and murder became a case study in institutionalizing obedience through manufactured moral frameworks. For planners who wanted stable, controllable polities, Vault 11 showed how to craft narratives and reward systems that lock populations into behaviors, translate belief into habit, and habit into predictable compliance. Vault Tech's telemetry and artifacts also created technological leverage. Vault doors, automated life support, remote monitoring arrays, and ration dispensing systems were scavenged and adapted. Brotherhood of Steel detachments reverse-engineered vault systems. Raider groups and organized tyrants used vault designs to construct fortified strongholds. More importantly, the bureaucratic outputs, files, overseer reports, experiment logs, survived in many vaults. Those documents became manuals, letting post-war factions skip generations of costly trial and error and adopt tested methods for population management, biomedical manipulation, and infrastructure control. This repurposing shows up repeatedly across Fallout's lore. Certain factions explicitly seek FEV and other Vault-derived technologies. Others adopt Vault Tech's managerial language and rituals when building communities. Even failed experiments were instructive. Catastrophic collapses demonstrated limits, how long a system could be pushed, which interventions produced irreversible mutation, or what kinds of social engineering backfired. Vault Tec catalogued failures as results. Others read those catalogues as operational intelligence. Underlying it all was a moral calculus that fused profit, security, and utilitarian reasoning that devalued individual lives. Vault Tec profited from government contracts and from selling safety to a terrified public while running a classified research stream that rationalized human experimentation as necessary for the survival of the species. Treating people as datasets rather than citizens made it easier for planners to accept high mortality and ethical violations. Vault Tec's secret communications reframed catastrophe as a field lab where costs were acceptable collateral damage for long-term control. Public contracts funded private research. Private research promised knowledge that could secure elite power after the bombs fell. The consequences were technical and political. Data on who adapted to scarcity could be used to build selection policy. Techniques that produced obedient microsocieties could scale into governance templates. Biological interventions that increased physical robustness or created altered workforces could be weaponized or institutionalized. In every case, Vault Tec converted uncertainty into a menu of options for shaping the post-war world. Options that favored centralized control and privileged those with access to Vault Tec's files and equipment. That conversion, from experiment to strategy, is Vault Tec's most damning legacy. The company didn't merely study survival. It prototyped pathways that intentionally favored certain populations, behaviors, and biological outcomes. It left behind mutated bodies and traumatized communities, yes, but also a library of practices and technologies others could adopt to rebuild society on terms chosen by the pre-war elite. Across the wastes, Vault Tec's fingerprints are visible in who holds power, what technologies maintain it, and which ethical shortcuts became normalized. The vaults were laboratories that engineered not only outcomes, but options, blueprints for domination disguised as lifeboats. Vault Tec's vaults were never just shelters. They were deliberate social and biological laboratories built to convert uncertainty into actionable options for a select few. Private contracts turned catastrophe into controlled study. The data and techniques taken from those vaults were used to decide who would thrive, who would obey, and who would be expendable in any rebuilt society. Fallout isn't haunted only by radiation and monsters, but by engineered policies and blueprints for power. Mutations, trauma, and broken communities are the visible damage. Less visible is a catalogue of governance tools and ethical compromises that shape who rules the wastes and how they maintain control. The dark truth is simple. Vault Tec didn't just save humanity, it prototyped how to remake it. That recasts Vault Tec from tragic savior to intentional architect, and changes how we read every ruined vault and surviving faction.